Last week, we got into a fiery debate about the root causes of why Venezuelans are fleeing their country and risking their lives and the lives of their children, all for a chance at asylum here in the United States. While the Biden administration has blamed communism and political persecution, co-founder of the Revolutionary Blackout Network, Nick Cruz, blamed U.S. sanctions and interference in the global South. Let's watch.
Height of irony, the Democrats and Pierre, they complain about January 6th. If you look at the coups they sponsor in these countries that she listed, that January 6th is child play compared to what we do to Venezuela. We back Bolsonaro, who used to send death squads into Venezuela to assassinate and kill Maduro supporters. You had the hard far-right fascists in Venezuela that was setting left-wing supporters of Nicolas Maduro on fire in the streets. These are the people that we support. So the idea that you're going to blame an economic model instead of our actions is ridiculous on face value.
So I wanted to bring in someone who has a different perspective. This is Daniel DiMartino. Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
Thanks, Robbie.
Yeah, and after we did this segment with Nick Cruz, he had this very strong, far to the left view of what was going on, and so I wanted to offer some pushback from someone I know is an expert from the other perspective. So, what is your view of what has gone wrong in Venezuela?
Well, my eyes were popping as I was listening to what the other guest was saying, because it's just completely false, right? People don't flee even because of targeted political persecution in the millions, right? You're not seeing millions of Iranians crossing the border over to Turkey. You're not seeing millions of people leaving from, say Saudi Arabia, where women have no rights. But you are seeing millions of people fleeing Venezuela, because the difference between all these countries and Venezuela is that even though they're all authoritarian, there's no democracy. The difference is that Venezuela does not respect private property. There's no economic opportunity, and the average person makes less than $100 a month. And that is not because of U.S. sanctions. That is not because of the oil price. That is completely because the government decided to take over the means of production, overregulate businesses, and totally crumble the economy.
Daniel, the argument that Nick was making wasn't that people were fleeing in large numbers because of political persecution specifically. The argument was that there have been a number of interventions on the part of the U.S. government into Venezuela's economy. There have been obviously sanctions, which you mentioned just there. And there is an obvious gap between Venezuela having the world's largest oil resources and its ability to capitalize them on the global market. But for sanctions, I wonder what you attribute to the idea that it can't seem to be able to monetize to great financial benefit what is one of the largest source of one of the most valuable commodities on the globe.
Yeah, Venezuela has a lot of oil underground. The sanctions are not what's stopping the Venezuelan regime from taking that oil above ground. What destroyed Venezuela's oil production capacity has been years of state-owned oil industries. Since the 1970s, this is even before Chavez, Venezuela's oil production peaked, because that's when the government took over the oil industry and they just decided to start using the money to give away free things to people instead of investing in the necessary capital, renovations, maintenance that would allow Venezuela to refine and produce oil into gasoline. Venezuela used to have some of the largest refineries in the world, and they exploded. There were literal explosions of gas and oil facilities in the north coast of Venezuela. And that's not because, as the regime blames, Marco Rubio hacked some systems. It is simply because they have not decided to invest in the facilities. For the people who are concerned about sanctions, Venezuela has a few sanctions in place by the U.S. government. One of them is that the U.S. is not going to buy oil from them. Now, I don't know why people who are on the left, who are so mad when the U.S. trades with other countries, we get mad when the U.S. just decides to stop trading with the Venezuelan regime. These sanctions aren't even broad like what we see in Cuba or Iran. You can send food, you can send money, you can send medicines to Venezuela right now from where we are in the United States. There are thousands of people who use dozens of companies based out of Miami and Houston to send food home to home in Caracas. That would be impossible to do for families in Iran or Cuba. Then why do you see people starving in Venezuela and not in Iran and escaping those countries? I think that's where the cost lies. It's the policies of those regimes. It's not the U.S.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody would argue that, of course, just like in the United States and Pretty much every country in the world, there's corruption that it always is going to have an impact here. And there are poor decision makings that can happen under capitalism and under socialism as well. But when you look across the world at a number of petrostates that are under national control in Europe, in Canada, and even the kind of oil dividends that happen in Alaska, certainly isn't a feature of national ownership that causes a diminishment in the quality of the industry having run. What we're seeing right now in Italy is that some of the only industries that have withstood the extreme economic decline the country has been in for some time are those industries which were nationalized at the time the economic crisis started. So this conversation began because Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, attributed the migration exclusively to communism, and it seemed to be a moment where they were trying to somehow preserve the integrity of capitalism as an institution, despite all of the capitalist countries, all of the world's countries, which basically are capitalist, and none of which are communist, in fact. And to do a little bit of punching at the left, it didn't seem necessary in the moment. I mean, do you believe that Venezuela is a communist country and was rightly and communism was rightly described as the cause of the immigration per Karine Jean-Pierre?
Well, I think you made a lot of points there, so let me address them.
Sure.
First, you mentioned something about Italy and the state-owned industries being withstanding the economic crisis. Alitalia, the state-owned airline of Italy, has gone broke more times than I can count. There are no state-owned industries in Italy that have withstood any crisis.
Oh, that's not true. And we'll have a guest on later today who's
Sure.
tweeted about this and talked about this.
I can tell you this because my grandparents are Italian. They live in Italy. I've been to Italy many times. It's well known there. Their economy is not well.
Right, but
Venezuela,
that's the point that I'm making, actually, that their economy is not well. But many people have pointed to, including a guest we'll be talking to later today, the fact that there's particular industries that have been able to stand the test, despite the overwhelming majority of industries that have crumbled being privately owned in their current economic crisis. But somehow it is not, when a private industry collapses and fails, it's not attributed to capitalism. And so we're just trying to tease out why it is that every failure that happens in a free market context is attributed to, oh, well, that's just what it is. It's not an indictment of the free market system.
Well, because under the market system, there will be failures. But the premise of the market system is there will be some firms will fail and some will succeed. But when the system is government run, there's no competition for it. So it will fail because it is not subject to those pressures because it doesn't have competition from some other firm.
But Robbie, the expectation isn't that being nationalized, it insulates you against any negative consequences or struggling as a business, point blank and period. People are part of a global economy. There are all sorts of factors that are going to impress upon you regardless. The question is, why is it that the answer to every crisis is always privatization, no matter how negative the effects of said privatization are, when there are myriad examples of successful nationalization across the world, and those aren't pointed to as an example of why everything should be nationalized. I'm not even sitting here saying everything should be nationalized or everything should be privatized. I'm not the one who went out of my way to attack capitalism the way Karine Jean-Pierre attacked communism.
I can address what you mentioned about state-owned oil industries in other countries, right? Well, so, you can begin with what happens in the Middle East, where those are in name state-owned oil industries, but in reality, they're privately owned by the royal families of those countries. They basically function as the cash cow of a family and as a private company. If you want to look at a more successful state-owned oil industry, you have to look at Norway, where they basically made it independent from the government, the company. The company has shareholders. They try to function as a quasi-private entity because the difference between governments and private industries is that governments maximize votes while private industries maximize profit. If you have a company that maximizes votes like what we had in Venezuela with not just the oil industry, but basically every single thing the government took, from agriculture to banking to manufacturing, the government tried to hire more people than they needed. They lowered the price below cost. And of course, all the industries went broke. That's not what happens in Norway. In fact, they try to maximize profit to save money for the national fund, to reduce taxes. It's a totally different mentality.
So is that an advocacy then for a Norwegian model of state ownership of the oil companies?
No, because, well, I think that if you were to have a state-owned oil industry in Venezuela, the government is definitely going to take the money to give things for free to people. And just look at what happens here in the United States. What is state-owned in this country? USPS, excellent, billions of dollars every year that we lose to taxpayers. The veterans healthcare system, where we have the worst healthcare for the people who did the most for
Daniel, that's not
freedom.
true. The veterans healthcare system, it has its flaws for sure, in part because Republicans keep trying to cut the funding, just like they keep trying to cut UPS funding. So what ends up happening in the United States of America is that there is a targeted attack on social programs, and then the failure of those social programs is blamed on them being national programs, as opposed to the concerted efforts to undermine them.
These
and I would just like to say, for the record, that many people think that giving people to stuff for free when there's an enormous amount of income inequality in a country is exactly what should be done. And that kind of cavalier indifference to whether or not there are people who are really struggling in a country is why you get revolutions in the first
But Daniel,
instance.
before we go, can you speak a little bit to you're Venezuelan. I'm sure you still have family there. To the actual, who is rewarded, who is given money, how does the corruption and the persecution actually work in practice?
Well, I mean, there's a very easy way to end inequality, and that is to do what Venezuela did, where now everybody makes very little money and there's very much income equality, around $100, $50 to $200 a month. My family was making $3,000, $4,000 a month in the early 2000s, like many American families did. And by 2016, when I left, I was making $100 a month. If I had stayed, the best future that I could have had was to be able to feed myself. I saw moms fighting other moms in the street with knives for trash to feed their kids. This is happening now. That's why millions of people are fleeing. That's why people are crossing all the way to Colombia, then Panama, all Central America, Mexico, to come to the southern border from Venezuela. And it is socialism. I mean, it is not just another corrupt Latin American country. It is not even about the authoritarian of the political regime, because there are many authoritarian countries without millions of people fleeing. It is about the government destroying the economy. And I am honestly so angry that the left in this country keeps blaming sanctions. You know what? Congratulations to Karine, to Jean-Pierre, the press secretary, for saying it like it is. It is socialism. It is communism, because it is state ownership of the means of production that destroy Venezuela. No, nationalizations are not good. I do not want to live in the Soviet Union or in Venezuela.
I got to correct that's not the definition of socialism or communism. Just like you can have market forces in a communist or socialist party, as you described in a country.
As you described, socialism is not the state ownership of the means of production.
It's not a communist government. It's not a socialist government. It's more than that. And you can have
it's the textboook definition.
You can have state ownership. We have state-owned companies here, just like he just pointed out with UPS. That doesn't make
and they're socialist.
That doesn't make us a socialist country. You think America is a socialist country now?
No, but that's a socialist policy. If you stay at state ownership, that's what it is.
Jean-Pierre said that Venezuela was a communist country. That's what's being debated here. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.